Alright, so this video is the making of a Valentine's Day gift for my wife. Sort of an odd place to start. I realize in a shop, stripping some Romex, but I think the end result turned out pretty nice. So I'm actually after the bare copper wire that's in this Romex. You certainly can buy just bare copper wire. You don't have to strip it from Romex, but I had this Romex, and the leftover conductors from the stripping will be used for other things. There's the 3 wires with the middle wire, the one I'm after. I was originally going to only use a single wire for each piece, but as I was stripping it, I decided that it was felt too flimsy, and also to add some depth, I decided that I was gonna twist 2 of the wires together, and that actually turned out well for another piece of the project later on. You can certainly twist the wires together by hand, but I'll end up using my drill to twist them together. So I'm just stripping another length out here. So I'm just starting the twist here so I can feed this end into my drill and make it a little easier than trying to get 2 loose ends in there. I mean, you could certainly continue to twist it by hand, but that would take a while. And at this point, I'm not entirely sure how I'm gonna accomplish the picture that I have in my head. I've popped in my head a few weeks ago, and I had been thinking about it, and I did some initial testing and some sort of mocking up, I guess you could say, but I'm not entirely sure exactly how I'm gonna do it. I'm just sort of making it up as I go along. You'll see here that one wire isn't even, so I'm gonna have to adjust it here. But I get it in the drill first and sort of and get it chucked in, and then use the drill as an anchor to help get the wires even. So here I'm starting the twisting it up. And I got it pretty tight. I was a little concerned that I might break the wire, but I was able to get it pretty tight. And this is actually pretty fun. Now the copper was nice and shiny, and I didn't want nice shiny copper, and so what I ended up doing was using a torch, a blowtorch, to heat it up, to sort of give it a if you've ever seen copper that's been heated up, it gets sort of these rainbowy discolorations on them. So I'm clamping it back down here so I can do that. Wonder if having if heating it up and then quenching it in water would have resulted in maybe something, I don't know, maybe better or different. But this worked out okay. This torch doesn't get very hot, so it kind of took a little bit of time. I mean, we had to linger in some areas and stuff. Didn't want to linger too long because I did notice that it started to turn a little black, or a little, not black, but just dark gray. If I was there for too long, so I'm just sort of going along and just watching the wire as it turns color, just to get the effect that I want. So you can see in this shot here what heating up does. So here we've moved into the house, and I'm using that glass cleaner can just as to sort of bend that wire and get a nice round shape for what'll be the outer ring of the project. And I'll note that I'm using my my Heiko soldering iron here, which I love. But if I were to make another one of these, I would actually probably do all the soldering of the main heavy wire with a torch, just because as great as the Heiko is, at least with the tip I have on mine, I have a fairly medium-sized or small tip. It was just you had to sit there for a while to get that copper heated up, so that the solder would flow. Here I'm just taking some small gauge wire from actually some leftover Cat 5 wire to hold the two ends in place. And really quick, I'm just getting the size just to make sure that it's sort of, I guess, in proportion to the pot that I'll end up using. I was overlapping the joints here, and it may be cleaner to have butted the joints together and then sort of wrapped the wire between the two, and then put the solder on. But hindsight is what it is. And so I've got that wire just wrapped around the joint. Just temporary. I wasn't intending at this point to keep it on there, which ends up being a mistake later. You'll notice that I have to keep that soldering iron. I've got that soldering iron turned up almost as high as it'll go, and I've got to keep it on there for a while, and that to get the solder to flow. And consequently, it's also making the entire ring very hot, which I neglect to keep in mind, as you'll see here later. Yeah, hot wire's hot. So I snip off that that temporary wire, and that ends up being a mistake, as you'll see here in a second. And a bunch of you are screaming at me, knowing exactly what's going to happen, as I'm just trying to fill in this little spot where some solder didn't flow. Oh, there it is. It came apart. So I decided at this point that I'm just going to, I'm going to cool it off first so I can actually touch it. But I'm going to use that smaller gauge wire and wrap all the way around, or at least around the part of that joint, and then just keep it on there and just solder it all together. I actually do end up switching later on to my old Wheeler soldering iron, because it's got a wider tip than the Heiko, and I was running that at full power. Again, if I was going to do this again, and there you can see that's actually before the final soldering. The solder that's on there is from the first attempt, but there you can see the joint. So you can see how butting them together and then wrapping the wire between the two ends might have produced a little bit of a smoother joint, but this worked out. So, but yeah, if I was going to do this again, I would probably come up with a temporary way to hold the inner and the outer rings together, and use a torch to solder it all together. So these are one of the 8mm LEDs that I'm going to end up using for this, and I'm just trying to get an idea of the size for the inner ring, get an idea of spacing and all that. So here I'm just using a smaller can to see if see if it'll work, and then to form the inner ring. Actually, end up making the inner ring quite a bit smaller after this, because I realized that it doesn't give me that at the size I'm making it currently. It doesn't give me enough room to really work. And it's put together the same way the outer ring was. I overlapped the ends, and then wrapped some thinner gauge wire around and soldered it all together. There's the inner ring, at least the first version of it, all completed. And you'll notice later on that it does get quite a bit smaller from that. That size was a bit ambitious. So these are 8mm LEDs. They're going to end up being wired in parallel with a resistor on each LED. Probably, maybe not the best way to do it in terms of labor intensiveness, but you could certainly, a better way would be to solder them all just straight on, and then use like a constant current supply. But this worked out okay. Just a lot of 68 ohm resistors in this case. And just of note, the inner ring will end up being the positive side, and the outer ring will be negative. The whole thing will be driven by a 3.3 volt wall wart. So this is the initial sort of sizing of everything, trying to get it all positioned, and this is after this first LED, I think, is when I realized that I was going to have to make that inner ring smaller. You'll actually notice that in this shot, the inner ring is significantly smaller. I've got the first LED on, and just to sort of support everything and not stress out the joint of that first LED, I'm going to just use some painter's tape here to support the two rings so I can get the other LEDs on. Again, I'm not sure at this point still how I'm going to accomplish everything. Like I said, I've got an idea. I've got a basic plan, but I don't know how many LEDs I'm going to put on this ring, and so I'm just sort of figuring that stuff out as I go along. And I'm having to, because how hot the soldering iron needs to be, and how long I'm having to set it on there to get it to flow and to bond correctly. I do a fair amount of testing. I was fairly concerned about damaging the LEDs because of it, but they all turned out okay in the end. But I did some fairly constant testing. I think it was nearly almost every LED. After every LED I put on, I would check to make sure that they lit up correctly. Another thing I was actually concerned about, but didn't end up having a problem with, was because it was getting so hot, and you can see that I'm using the air there to cool it down so I can handle it again, but was it actually starting to pop the joints of the other LEDs as I went along, but that ended up not being a problem. So you can see the two LEDs on there, and this wasn't a precision project, and I didn't mean for it to be precision or symmetrical necessarily. This inner ring ended up being fairly symmetrical with the distribution, with the way the LEDs were positioned around it, but there I was just marking the where I wanted to bend the LED so that I can at least get some idea of where it was gonna, or so it would end up in relatively close to where I wanted it to end up, to give me enough space for for the resistor and everything else. So there I am testing it, making sure they come on, and they do. So you can see that's actually nearly completed. There's one LED missing, I think. So now I'm starting to add the pedals here. And those are actually the same copper wire. And I was originally going to make them just, straight, not wavy like that one is. But I ended up taking some of the copper wire that I had twisted and untwisting it, and that's how I got the sort of wavy pedal there. And actually, I'm actually doing this pedal basically completely wrong. Again, the inner ring is the positive side, and the outer ring is negative. So that pedal, that part of the pedal being the outer part, really just should be soldered onto the outer ring, but I'm soldering it onto both one end onto the inner and one end onto the outer, which is actually just shorting everything out. And I will realize this in a minute here. So here I'm using some nail polish to coat where the inner ring wire will cross over, just to keep or prevent shorting out. Not strictly necessary, I realize later on, but I suppose a good measure. It's about here, I think, that I look at it and I start to realize that I actually did that completely wrong. I've got one end on one and one end on the other, and yeah, that's not going to work. And I think I tell myself that here in a second. So I fixed that, and putting some flux on that just to help the solder flow a little bit better. But yeah, the nail polish again, not I realized that it wasn't strictly necessary. The wires were stiff enough that I don't think it would be a problem, and nail polish actually sort of got in the way a little later on. Even though I keep showing footage of me applying it, it did sort of get in the way a little later on with the soldering when the pedals started to get closer together, because it would spill over and it would make it a little more difficult to solder. So not strictly necessary. Effective though, actually, in preventing, even if the wires touch, coating the outer ring, and then also a little bit on the back of the pedal at the point that it crossed over. So you'll notice that the LED distribution on the pedals is not even. I had actually originally sort of thought that it was going to be sort of even and symmetrical, but as I was doing it, I decided that would look odd. I think it looks okay in the center ring, and it's almost sort of called for in the center of the. I'm just going to call it a flower. I think you realize what it is by now. But on the pedals, I think it would have looked odd if they were sort of evenly spaced. There's no sort of practical reason why you couldn't add more if you really wanted to add more. You can see now that I've actually switched to my older Wheeler soldering iron. It has a wider tip, so it transfers the heat a little bit better. It makes it a little bit more tolerable on the soldering. So basically the process was solder one end of the LED, the negative side, on the outer part of the pedal, and then solder the one end of the resistor onto the inner pedal, and then solder it onto the LED. And again, the distribution, just like the pedal sizes, I sort of randomly just made the pedals one size or another. The distribution of the LEDs on the pedals is fairly random. And actually, the one pedal, the smallest pedal, I was actually worried about that for quite a while. Actually, I think I'm actually working on that one right here. I was actually worried about that because I felt like I was a little worried that it might have been too small, but I think it ended up working out. Of course, constant testing just to make sure that I wasn't burning up the LEDs. So here I've got the legs or the stem attached, and I'm getting the green LEDs for that out. Use the twisted copper wire for the stem, so it's stiffer. I've got two. One goes to the inner positive ring, and the other to the outer negative ring. And on that as well, I've got some where the positive wire crosses the negative. I put some nail polish just to help keep it from shorting in case it touches. Which again, I don't think it will. It's fairly stable. So here I'm doing a test fit. I bent the leads of the stem in opposite directions, sort of make feet. And here I'm taking the power cord and just checking the polarity so that I can mark which one is positive and which is negative on this cord. I end up finding later that little black nub, which I think is a ferrite core, on the end of that cord ends up getting in the way, so I end up having to rewire that a little bit later. So here I'm soldering on the leads for that cord. I've got a fair amount of excess there, so I can have plenty of room to work with, and I'm heat shrinking everything and all that. So here comes a really fun part. I'm doing a quick test fit, and then I am just dumping a ton of hot glue into the bottom of that pot, and then smushing the feet in there for the flower, and then putting a bunch more hot glue in there. I realized that the cord was interfering with the pot wouldn't sit flat because of the cord coming out, and I thought I could deal with that by putting some little rubber feet on the end of the pot, but that was not working out well. So sort of clinched and started grinding a notch out of the pot for the cord to fit through, and using my Dremel here with just a cutoff wheel, and actually it worked really well. I was surprised. I was really worried about cracking the pot or damaging it in some way, but it's actually worked well. And the only thing I wish I would have done was have done it outside, because it was sort of messy. Here's some pictures of the finished flower, and it turned out pretty well, I think. Wife seems to like it, and it's pretty close to what I was picturing in my head. Like I said, I think the only thing that I would do differently if I was going to make another one would be to solder the main body of the flower with a torch rather than a soldering iron. Just use a soldering iron for soldering the LEDs on.